ever heard a story so unbelievable it feels like it can't possibly be real? Well, the story that I'm going to share with you today, that of the Stayner brothers, is one of those. It's tragic, it's heartbreaking, and honestly, it's hard to wrap your head around. On one side of this story, you've got Steven Stayner, a kid who was kidnapped at just 7 years old and held captive for years, and then somehow found the courage to escape and save another child in the process. It's a story of survival that inspired so many. Stephen was lauded as a hero. But then there's his older brother Carey. Years later, Carey's name would make the headlines for something completely different, something chilling. He went from being the other brother to a convicted serial killer known as the Yosemite Killer. How does something like this happen in the same family? How do two brothers' lives end up on such drastically different paths? In the next two episodes, we're diving into the Stayner family story, taking a look at how two brothers can go on to lead completely different lives. Are Carey's crimes connected to Stephen's stories, or would Carey have always gone on to become a killer no matter what? This case is a fascinating look at nature versus nurture, and today we're going to be talking about Stephen's side of the story, next week, Carey's. The tale begins in 1972 in a town called Merced in California, which is known as the gateway to Yosemite National Park, which is located about 2 hours to the east. Whilst a decently populated town now, in the 70s, Merced only had a population of about 22,000 people, and it was considered, as it always is, to be a very safe place. It was once this very small farming town, but was growing year by year. The Stayner family consisted of parents Delbert and Kay and their 5 children. Carey was the oldest, and then there was one sister, Stephen, and 2 more sisters. The family lived on Betty Street, this very middle-class neighbourhood in a nice part of town. Del earned a decent living as a mechanic at the peach canning factory, whilst Kay was a full-time mother caring for their 5 children. And the family was pretty ordinary for the time. It's not like there are any big dark secrets behind the scenes, or maybe there were. We'll get to that in the second episode. But at least as far as anyone was aware from the outside, there was nothing big and dark going on. Kay has been described by some who knew her as quite cold. The Stayners weren't really the kind of family in which you spoke about your feelings, like things just kind of got brushed under the rug. But sadly, that was pretty normal for a middle-class family in the 70s. Hey, that's normal for a lot of families nowadays. Carey, the oldest kid, was said to be a very nice kid. He was kind of quiet, but there was nothing outwardly unusual about him as a child. He had friends, and he was super close with his brother, Stephen. The pair were pretty inseparable. They shared a room, they played together all the time, they were just really close. And Stephen was just your normal kid. He was happy, healthy, again, plenty of friends. Life was generally really good for the Stayner children. That is until the 4th of December 1972. Little did the Stayners know that a couple of hours away, hidden away in Yosemite National Park, was a man in his 40s called Kenneth Parnell, who was planning a horrific crime. 20 years earlier, Parnell had been arrested for impersonating a police officer and raping a young boy. He was sentenced to just 4 years in prison for this crime. A decade later, he was convicted of armed robbery and went to prison again before being released in the late 60s. After that point, having been in prison twice for quite serious crimes, he would have struggled to get a job, somewhere to live. But throughout his life, Parnell had always escaped to Yosemite when he just wanted to get away from things. Yosemite also just so happens to be a place where a lot of criminals could find work with very limited background checks. Not many people want to go live and work in a national park. They were generally in this time going to take who they could. So that's where Kenneth Parnell goes now. He gets a job at the Yosemite Lodge where he works as a night auditor, which is basically just a nighttime receptionist who also performs accounting checks. And this work left him with a lot of time to think about what he wanted in life, and what he wanted was a child. But not a child to simply parent. He already had one of those. He had a daughter from a previous marriage, but as far as I could find, he didn't really have much contact with her. And besides, he wasn't all that interested in young girls. So Parnell enlists the help of another employee, a janitor at the lodge called Irvin Murphy, and asks him to help abduct a child. Irvin was considered to be, at the time, a kind of odd person. He was incredibly simple-minded. He was a trusting and gullible sort who never really asked many questions. Like, he would do anything people asked of him. Some sources I read said he had an intellectual disability. Other sources admitted that entirely, so I'm not really sure. All I know is he was very, very overly trusting. So when Parnell came to him asking for help getting a son, Irvin agreed. Apparently Irvin just always believed people at face value, and that was kind of that, at least that's what they said at trial. And when Parnell came to him, passing himself off as a very religious man and aspiring minister, Irvin agreed to help, believing that this boy that they abducted would be raised in religion. This was what was for the best. At least that's what the narrative has kind of always been. It would later come out at trial that this wouldn't be the first kidnapping the pair had attempted. Apparently they did this a few times before they got Steven. I'm not really sure, but the idea the defence put forward at trial was that Irvin was just this very gullible, very trusting man who just did anything people asked of him. On the 4th of December 1972, Parnell and Irvin headed from Yosemite into Merced, parking up near the main road heading out of the town back to the national park. This was the Yosemite Parkway, just one long road made for a very quick getaway. Irvin is instructed to hand out religious pamphlets to boys as they walk home from school that afternoon, and one of these boys was 7-year-old Steven Stayner. Steven Stayner had just left school. He was walking home about 4 blocks into his journey when he was approached by Irvin Murphy, who asked him if he thought his mother would be willing to make a charitable donation to the church. Steven replied that yes, he definitely thought his mother would, to which Irvin asked where he lived. Would he like a lift home so they can chat to his mum about all of this and get a donation? Steven, being a 7-year-old boy who was always taught to trust and respect his elders, readily agreed. I mean, why wouldn't he? He was going to get a lift home. As he agreed to this, a white Buick van driven by Ken Parnell pulled up next to them, and Steven readily climbed into the cab and off they started to drive. But instead of driving further into Merced to the Stayner home, they began to drive towards Yosemite. They attempted to distract Steven with toys on this drive, which did work for a little bit, and then eventually they pulled up at a payphone. Parnell got out and walked over to the phone pretending to make a call, and when he returned he told Steven that that was his mother on the phone. Apparently his mum said that they didn't want him anymore. But it was fine, Parnell said. He was now going to raise Steven as his son and everything would all be okay. Eventually, Parnell would say that he'd been to court and seen Steven's parents and they'd signed over full custody. And Steven was very confused by this. Of course he was. He was 7 years old, so he was kind of old enough to have some awareness of the situation. But again, like I said, he'd been raised to respect his elders and not cause a fuss, not talk about feelings or emotions. His parents were incredibly strict, and just the day before he'd got in trouble for something very minor. So I can imagine in this 7-year-old's head, maybe he really did believe that his parents might not want him anymore, that he was in trouble. They eventually arrived in Yosemite. Parnell kept Steven in his room for about a week and he was looked after by Irvin Murphy. He was given copious amounts of cough syrup to sedate and confuse him, and if he was confused and dazed, it was going to be much easier to convince him of this new reality. Parnell spent the entire week and weeks after just very subtly brainwashing Steven. And this is all whilst a very intense search for Steven is going on back home in Merced. That evening, when their son didn't return home from school, Kay and Dell were obviously incredibly concerned. They asked around the neighbours if anyone had seen him. They searched by themselves for a couple of hours before eventually contacting the police and calling in all local family and friends to help with the search. Through eyewitness accounts, it was eventually discovered that Steven had been taken in a van from Yosemite Parkway, but that's about where the trail ended. Steven had gone, and with each day that passed, the likelihood of him being found alive got slimmer and slimmer. The entire Stayner family changed on that day, in that exact moment. In a 2002 interview, Steven's younger sister Cynthia, who was now an adult, said that their father Dell went on a mission trying to find his son. The family would constantly send out flyers. They would head out on these long road trips to talk to anyone who might have had literally any information about Steven, and it took over Dell's life for a very long time. And eventually he just shut it out. It got to a point where they couldn't even watch the news in case Steven was mentioned, and any mention of him would just make Dell cry. Meanwhile, Kay, the mother, shut off her feelings even further, and the children learned to keep their feelings to themselves. They didn't discuss emotions, they didn't discuss their brother, they were just left on their own to work through their trauma. Carey, the oldest child and incredibly close to Steven, also shut off. Once a very happy young child, he became reclusive and withdrawn. He didn't have loads of friends and was always just known in school as the boy whose brother was kidnapped. The entire family was just torn apart by this. But little did they know, Steven was still alive. He was still in the state. He was just a couple of hours away. On the night of his disappearance, Dell called his father-in-law, so Kay's dad, to tell him about what happened and ask him for his help. Kay's dad lived in Yosemite, and little did he know that his grandson was being kept in a cabin just a few hundred feet away from his own. If he'd raised his voice and shouted, Steven may well have heard, but of course there was no way of knowing that. On that first night, drugged up on cough medicine, Parnell molested Steven. Over the coming weeks, this would extend into full rape, Steven being treated as Parnell's son during the day, whilst being horrifically abused overnight. At first, apparently Steven just repeatedly asked to return home. He was worried his parents would be angry with him. He shared stories of his life, his family, and Parnell weaponized these stories against him. He found out that just the day before he was abducted, Steven had gotten into trouble for something very small, so he told him that was the reason why his parents didn't want him anymore. Steven was just 7 years old. It really didn't take much for him to soon be brainwashed. Parnell told him that he had gone to a judge and been granted full custody. Parnell was his father now, and this was Steven's new life. Only from this point onwards, he wouldn't be called Steven. His new name was Dennis Gregory Parnell, and Ken was to be called Dad. I mean, Parnell didn't even change Steven's middle name. He found out that his middle name was Gregory and just kept it. He really didn't go that deep into trying to conceal who Steven was. He just kind of assumed that it was all going to work out for him, and it did for a very long time. Although in this time of his life, Steven was called Dennis, I'm just going to keep calling him Steven because, well, that was his name. Within a number of weeks of the abduction, Parnell and Steven went on a road trip across California. They stayed in a number of different motels, just jumping from place to place. They did eventually settle for a short time in Santa Rosa, where Steven, as Dennis, was enrolled at Kiwanis Springs Elementary School. And this school didn't make any efforts to get a hold of past records or official documents for Dennis Parnell, so no red flags were raised there. But Parnell literally enrolled Steven using his real date of birth, his real middle name, Gregory. Like, if they'd looked into it even slightly, surely they would have found something. But I suppose this was a time before digital records would have been a thing, so really, what could the school have done? I don't know, something for sure. Somebody surely must have noticed something, and how they never did is beyond me. The pair travelled around a lot. They never really settled in one place for a long time. I mean, presumably Parnell was worried that people would get a scent of something being wrong if they stuck around for too long. Every night he would assault Steven before sending him off to school the next day in whatever place they were now living in. And you might think it strange that Parnell even allowed Steven to go to school, allowed him out of his sight, but this was deeply rooted brainwashing. Steven was told from day one that his family didn't want him anymore and that he was now Dennis, and whilst he always kind of knew in the back of his head that something wasn't right, he'd been, in a way, perfectly primed for this, taught to always respect his elders, to never fight back, to never question things. And now he was with Ken, he was also being allowed more freedom, more independence than he ever had before. He could come and go completely as he pleased, and as he came into his teenage years, he could drink and smoke freely. I mean, Parnell would even often travel away for work, leaving Steven alone for days at a time, and he never tried to escape. He just took for granted that this was his new life, this was who he was now. He thought his family had given up their custody. He thought he didn't have another family to go home to, and he fully believed that. I mean, he was allowed to stay overnight at friends' houses. Once in the 6th grade, he went on a school trip to San Francisco for multiple nights. He would often travel away with his football team once he reached high school. Steven would later say that he was aware that he could have ran away, he was aware that he could have got help, but he didn't know how. Parnell was just all he knew. He accepted that this was his life now, and after a few years, it just became normal. It's very easy to hear this and maybe judge Steven and his choices, but he was a kid and he was brainwashed. He was told that his family had abandoned him, that they'd handed over custody to Parnell in full. How was he supposed to believe any different? Newsweek would later summarise Steven's experience as him being gradually demoralised into self-willing captivity. Years later, Steven would recall good times that he had with Parnell. He also had your regular childhood memories and experiences. He remembered playing softball, going out riding bikes with friends, spending hours exploring nature. Parnell would also spoil him rotten. There were points where he could get away with anything he wanted, which of course just served to further confuse this child. By the time Steven was a tween, they'd ended up in a tiny place called Comptia in California. And this wasn't even a town, it's an unincorporated community with literally just a post office and a general store with less than 200 people living there. Steven and Parnell lived together in a trailer with their dog, Queenie. And there Steven attended Mendocino High School, where he was big on sport, and everyone who knew him at that time described him as incredibly mature. His friends knew that he had a lot of independence, he was allowed to come and go as he pleased, he was allowed drugs and cigarettes and alcohol as early as elementary school, and other students perceived him as being just very cool. Perception is such a funny thing, isn't it? Because I would have thought the same when I was a kid in school, seeing somebody else with this level of independence allowed to live as an adult. I would have thought that was the coolest thing ever. But now as an adult at 30 years old, I just see that and think how sad it is, how it's clearly neglect. It's weird, isn't it? But that was the least of Steven's problems, I suppose. He was going home every night and being sexually abused. He knew that that was wrong, he knew it wasn't normal, but also felt this deep shame about it. His greatest fear was people at school finding out. He was in this deep denial about his true reality. There was also a period of time when Steven was about 10, 11 years old when a woman called Barbara Matthias came to stay with the pair for about 18 months. She was Parnell's girlfriend at the time, and she also raped Steven on multiple different occasions as well. She would later claim that she was completely unaware that Dennis was kidnapped, but also she was a paedophile, so I'm not taking her at her word, an alleged paedophile. She allegedly raped Dennis/Steven. Teachers at school did notice some problems. They said that Steven had these behavioural issues, this deep anger within him that would rear its head occasionally. He also had some scrapes with the law. He was caught shoplifting at one point. He was caught using a BB gun to shoot the windows out of a local school. He was kept in custody at one point, and still no one ever connected the dots. But Steven wasn't this impenetrable wall. He did occasionally break down. There was one day in high school where he broke down and told his girlfriend that he wanted to go back to his real home. Of course, she didn't think much of it at the time, she was a teenager herself, but in hindsight, what he was saying here was pretty clear. There was also a time at a party where he got drunk and broke down talking about his past. He said that Dennis wasn't his real name, but teenagers get silly when they're drunk and they talk rubbish. Again, no one thought much of it. For Steven though, things were getting darker around this time. He was 13, 14 years old, he was coming into puberty, and Parnell's interest in him was waning. He liked young boys, not men. And this meant that Parnell started to plan his next victim. He needed a new young boy to satiate him. In 1979, Parnell moved the pair to this tiny rundown shack in a place called Manchester and started to prepare for another boy to join the family. He tried to enlist Steven to help him kidnap another boy, and whilst Steven never quite had the presence to save himself, he knew that he could not let another boy go through what he had. On the 13th of February 1980, over 7 years now since Steven was abducted, they went off to find a boy in the city of Ukiah. After driving around the city, Parnell spotted 5-year-old Tim White, who was playing alone outside of his parents' house. Parnell told Sean to get out of the car and pretend to have car trouble, asking Tim for his help. Parnell knew that Tim would likely react better to another kid than an adult approaching him, but Tim wasn't easily fooled. He immediately refused and tried to run inside to get his parents, but Sean grabbed him and pushed him against a chain link fence. Tim grabbed a hold of this fence and refused to let go as Sean forced him to loosen his grip, dragging him kicking and screaming into this car. And Parnell repeated the same process that he had with Steven immediately, trying to groom Tim with confusion and plenty of drugs to keep him subdued. He tried to convince Tim almost immediately that his new name was Tommy. He dyed his very distinctive blonde hair brown and introduced Steven to his new brother. And in that moment, Steven snapped, like a light went off in his head. Steven knew that no matter what, he was not going to let another young boy go through what he did. He immediately took Tim under his wings. He thought about his life, about what had happened to him. Steven became determined to return Tim to his parents and became his protector. Parnell brought Tim back to the cabin that he and Steven shared, and Steven just took this little 5-year-old under his wing. Steven was 14 years old and he would care for him, he would feed him, he would play with him, he would do everything he could to distract him from what was now going on. And as he was doing so, he was making a plan. 16 days after Tim's abduction, on the 1st of March 1980, Ken Parnell went to work, leaving Steven looking after Tim. And Steven decided to do something he'd never done before. He decided to escape. The area they were now living in was very remote, I'm sure by design. The pair had to walk a 1/4 of a mile down a dirt road until they were able to hitchhike a lift back into local Ukiah, where Tim was from. Once back in the city, little Tim was able to direct them to his babysitter's house, but no one was home, so instead, Steven got them to a local police station. He told Tim to walk inside and tell them who he was, but Tim was scared and deeply bonded to Steven at this point. He refused to go in without him. And meanwhile, officers in the station were watching as this happened and approached them. They thought something weird was going on. I don't think they knew exactly what the situation was here, but they could tell that something strange was happening. So officers approached and basically started questioning Steven as to who this young boy was. It's really interesting that still, even at this point, Steven just intended to get Tim inside to save Tim. It doesn't seem like he had any intentions to walk inside the station and save himself. Once the officers approached the boys, it became clear pretty quickly that this young boy was missing Timmy White. But who was this older boy? They thought he was some kind of con man, they thought that he was the kidnapper, and he introduced himself as Dennis at first, but he was obviously very shifty about his identity. And then, after a bit of prodding, a bit of poking, he said the words that would soon become famous around the world. He said, "I know my first name is Steven." After this, he actually wrote in a police statement, "My name is Steven Stayner," but he spelt it wrong with an I instead of a Y. "I'm 14 years of age. I don't know my true birth date, but I use April 18th, 1865. I know my first name is Steven. I'm pretty sure my last is Stayner, and if I have a middle name, I don't know it." He didn't know that Parnell had kept his real middle name of Gregory as his fake one. The officers, not really knowing what to make of this 14-year-old boy sat in front of them, started to go back through missing persons reports, missing persons posters, and indeed found a missing persons report for a Steven Stayner who had gone missing over 7 years beforehand. It was assumed that Stephen was dead. No one expected him to walk into a police station on this completely random evening, especially walking in seemingly perfect health, seemingly completely unharmed. But still, to that day, 7 years on, Stephen believed that his parents had chosen to give him up, that they had given him to Parnell. The officers took a great deal of time explaining to Stephen that that was not the case, that he had been abducted and his parents had been searching for him this entire time. And it took quite a while for them to convince him that they needed to call his parents. In the middle of the night on the 1st of March 1980, Kay and Dell get the call they've been waiting for, that their son has been found, and not only that, he's alive and he's going to be able to come home to Merced immediately. And by sunrise the next day, on the 2nd of March, Ken Parnell was arrested at his job as night security at a local motel. 19 days later, he was charged with kidnapping, child stealing, false imprisonment, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, conspiracy to commit child stealing, conspiracy to commit false imprisonment, and conspiracy to commit lewd and lascivious acts upon a child. For a very long time, Stephen refused to admit that he had been sexually abused by Parnell. He felt this deep shame about it. But when he did start to speak truthfully about his experience, Parnell wasn't charged with the sexual abuse. Most of the abuse occurred outside of the Merced County Prosecutor's jurisdiction, or it was outside the statute of limitations. The Mendocino County prosecutors, under whose jurisdiction sexual assaults did happen, just decided not to prosecute. Apparently there was a lack of evidence, but also a lack of understanding, and this deeply ingrained societal fear of homosexuality. It was better to just ignore it and hope it went away. In 1981, Parnell went on trial for the kidnappings of both Stephen and Tim. Stephen testified recounting the abduction and his years in captivity. The defence argued in court that Stephen could have chosen to leave at any time, but he chose not to. They tried to argue that the kidnapping could not be prosecuted because of California's 3-year statute of limitations. Basically, in the past few years, they said, Stephen was no longer kidnapped, he was choosing to stay. However, the prosecution fought back, stating that Stephen was a psychological prisoner, and thus the kidnapping continued until the day Stephen walked into that police station. Psychiatrists testified that Parnell had a disturbed childhood, that he'd attempted suicide at least twice, and he'd been the victim of a homosexual rape aged 13, and that's what made him the way he was. He had also been convicted and jailed for robbery, larceny, and abducting and molesting an 8-year-old boy, which occurred just after the birth of his only daughter. This was not a good guy. He was someone bound to offend again given the chance. And in terms of Stephen's mental state, a psychologist testified that Parnell alternated sexual abuse with extraordinary freedom and fun experiences as part of a very strong brainwashing technique. He told Stephen as a 7-year-old that a court had given him custody after his parents had abandoned him. Stephen thought he didn't have a family to go back to. He thought Parnell was all he had. Over the course of 7 years, Stephen developed a form of Stockholm syndrome, eventually coming to identify with his aggressor. The same psychologist said in court that even now he was free and back home with his family, Stephen remained uncomfortable with his feelings. He was very constricted in his ability to look at and interpret the outside world. He was struggling, perhaps even more so now he was free than when he had been held captive, and that really messed him up. And what I'm about to say next might induce an intense anger in you, because in the end, Kenneth Parnell was only sentenced to 7 years in prison. That was it. The same amount of time Stephen had been abducted for. And then he was released after just 5 years. Irvin Murphy and Sean Portman were also charged with their parts in the kidnappings. Both of the men claimed they knew nothing of the sexual assaults, and Murphy was sentenced to 5 years in prison. He served only 2 years before parole, with his attorney arguing that he was simply a nice guy who wanted to help somebody out. They argued that he was intellectually disabled. However, he did admit in testimony to attempting other kidnappings with Parnell as well. Stephen wasn't the first child, so take from that what you will. Sean Pullman, being a child himself, was sentenced to time in juvenile prison, in reform prison, and I couldn't find an exact length of sentence for him, but I do know it was shorter than the adult sentences, which were still much shorter than they should have been. So I'm sure Pullman was only in prison in reform school for maybe a year or so. Barbara Mathias, who Stephen has said did assault him, was not charged with anything after she cooperated with the authorities. She got away with her alleged crimes completely scot-free. So, by the late 1980s, everyone involved in this case was released, free to live their lives. And what did Ken Parnell want to be doing with his free life? Abducting young boys, of course. In 2003, he was arrested once again after attempting to purchase a young boy for $500. He asked his caregiver's sister to buy him a 4-year-old. Yes, buy him a 4-year-old. At this point in time, Parnell was seriously ill. He was in his 70s and was suffering with diabetes and emphysema. He'd also had a stroke, like he was in a very bad way. He had a full-time carer, and everyone in his life was aware of his past. And when he asked this of Diane Stevens, the caregiver's sister, she immediately contacted the police and helped them set up a sting operation. They basically pretended in this operation that they were setting up the purchase of a young boy. Parnell paid $100 for a birth certificate and had $400 cash on him to complete the transaction upon receiving the boy. On January 3rd, 2003, he was arrested, telling the authorities that all he was looking for was a family. He just wanted a son, he said. A year later, he was convicted on charges of attempting to purchase a child and attempted child molestation. His past, combined with some very questionable items found in his home, meant that he was very quickly found to have criminal intentions. He didn't just want a family, he wanted a child to molest, and he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. California has a 3 strikes law which imposes a life sentence automatically if you have 2 previous convictions for crimes defined as serious or violent. And this was his 3rd strike. He was out. You probably could argue that he should have been in prison still from Stephen's case, but he wasn't, and at least now he was going to die in prison. And he did. He died in prison just 4 years later in January 2008 of natural causes. He served just 9 years in prison in total. Stephen was kidnapped for 7 years. 9 years was not enough. And that's 9 years in total for Stephen's abduction and this attempted abduction. That's not even including the years before that. But just 9 years in prison. He abducted a child for 7 years and he only spent 9 years in total in prison. It's beyond words. But let's go back to talking about Stephen. Let's go all the way back to 1980. What happened after Stephen walked into that police station and identified himself? The police, like I said, trawled through old missing child bulletins until they came across the name of Steven Stayner. They reunited him with his parents and off he went back home. The media very quickly got wind of what was going on. Stephen literally arrived home depressed in front of his house. It was this complete whirlwind, and Stephen would later say that upon being reunited, he immediately recognised his parents. He said they'd barely changed, but he didn't recognise his siblings. They'd all grown up, like he didn't know them. His older brother Carey, who was once his best friend, was now unrecognisable in looks and personality, and Carey really struggled with his brother now being back with all the attention being on him. Within just days of returning home, Stephen finds himself in front of the whole country on Good Morning America, being asked about his ordeal. Everyone thought that he was a hero. He was a hero. He'd saved Tim White from a lifetime of abuse. He was immediately thrust into the media spotlight and wasn't given any time to recover from what had happened to him. He was back in the family, and that was that. Life was as normal, apart from his now fame, of course. His parents, Del and Kay, big fans of the stiff upper lip, the don't talk about your trauma approach, refused to get him any kind of counselling. He just had to dive back into life. But this was a problem because for years Stephen had been given incredible amounts of freedom. He was allowed to drink, smoke, do drugs, leave the house as and when he wanted. He didn't have rules or curfews. And now he was back with the Stainers, sharing a room with his very strange older brother, and he just felt incredibly trapped. And even school wasn't an escape. Stephen found himself being bullied mercilessly for the sexual abuse and rape that he had endured for years. He was called a homosexual, a pervert. After everything he had gone through, this was the thing that people focused on. Being gay in the early 1980s was considered the most shameful thing that you could be, especially for a school full of teenagers. And Stephen, of course, wasn't even gay. He'd been abused for years, but the details, they don't matter to teenagers. There were points when Stephen questioned whether he should have even returned home, like was his life easier before, even with the abuse? And so he turned to alcohol to numb the pain. He acted out, and it got so bad that his parents eventually kicked him out. There were a few real years of darkness for Stephen, these psychological wounds just unable to heal. But when Stephen sort of hit his late teens, early 20s, he did seem to start to turn things around. He seemed to find some sort of peace in his past. In 1985, he got married to a woman called Jodie Edmondson, and together they had 2 kids, Ashley and Stephen Jr. He was training to become a security officer. He had a full-time job in a pizza restaurant. He was supported and loved by his family. He worked with children and child abduction agencies, teaching them about stranger danger and how to keep themselves safe. And he also at this time worked with producers at NBC to make a mini-series based on his story, entitled I Know My First Name is Stephen. This show would go on to receive 4 Emmy Award nominations, but Stephen would never reach the Emmys. On the 16th September 1989, just the night before the awards, Stephen was out on his motorcycle on his way home from work when a car pulled out in front of him. He flipped the bike and died from his injuries at just 23 years old. From beginning to end, Steven Stayner's life was a tragedy. Just as he was beginning to turn things around, he had 2 kids, he was happy. It came to an awful end. But Stephen has a legacy. He saved Tim White. He was a hero. His life was fraught with trauma, but thanks to him, Tim's wasn't. Tim got to go home to his family after only 16 days. And in 2010, aged just 35 years old, he died after suffering a pulmonary embolism. Tim was married and also had 2 children. Tim's life was also short, but undeniably a better one than if Stephen hadn't saved him. Stephen was willing to let himself go through what he did, but he couldn't bear to watch it happen to somebody else. When Stephen died, Tim was just 14 years old, the same age Stephen was when they escaped, and he served as one of the pallbearers at Stephen's funeral. I wish I had a better note to end this episode on, but I don't. It's just a tragedy. And the story of the Stainers only gets worse after this point, when older brother Carey would become known as the Yosemite Killer, with 4 known victims. So stay tuned for the next episode where I dive into the story of his victims, into the story of Carey Stayner, and whether this was a case of nature versus nurture. Was Carey always going to end up becoming a killer? Or was the trauma of his childhood partly responsible? That will all be in next week's episode. Again, I wish I had a better note to end this episode on. I wish I had some sort of like slither of advice, a silver lining. I don't. It's a really, really sad story. But at least Stephen got to escape. He got to live the last few years of his life. He eventually became happy, had 2 children who carry on his legacy every day, and that is a beautiful thing. He's got Tim's 2 children who carry on his legacy, because without Stephen, Tim probably wouldn't have gone on to have his kids. Who knows what would have happened to them eventually? I don't know. Thank you so much for tuning in this week, and I will see you very soon for the next one. Bye guys.